All right, welcome into another episode of Sycamore 223. Today is June 3rd, 2020, and the show is going to be a little different from shows in the past where we usually keep it lighthearted and, not serious in the slightest, but considering the state of the country and the world and everything that's going on, we thought that we should try to at least comment on it in some way, but we're not really even sure where to begin. Jesse?
Yeah, typically we're inclined to stick to sports, but we've gotten to the point where we can just say, fuck that, to sticking to sports. It's worth mentioning that we're recording together for the first time in months due to the coronavirus, and that's nice, but the country's reopened, and, I have my thoughts about that, which we can get into later, but within a week of the country opening, a little bit too soon in my opinion, there's this horrible event in Minneapolis where, and I'm sure unless you've been living under a rock or just burying your head in the sand, you're aware of the situation that's going on, where a cop kneels on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and subsequently kills him. He walks free for 4 days before he's arrested and charged with third-degree murder, which has now been changed to second-degree murder. And just as of this morning, actually, a couple hours ago, the other 3 officers involved were arrested after spending more than a week just walking around. That led to perhaps the biggest outcry and just nationwide protesting since the civil rights movement. It has not been this dire. I've talked to some of the folks in my life who were alive during the civil rights movement. I'm just like, does this compare at all? And they're like, yeah, it's just as divisive. But you add in the domestic climate with the coronavirus, which it's another problem in itself. Like, everyone's forgotten that there's this absolute pandemic going on, and with all these protests, that's going to, I think, spike once again. My point being, it's shit out there. There's no reason to just make light of this and be like, just acting like shit's not going to happen. Having said that, we're both white. I've never experienced prejudice. I've been on the record saying that several times. I've never felt uncomfortable, honestly, in my life in terms of the way that people perceive me and my race. And you look outside and you look around the country with everything that's going on, and it's hard not to just get incredibly depressed. I texted you, Ryan, a couple of days ago. I'm just like, dude, I'm fucking bummed, man. I don't know what to do. And that's the thing. Nobody knows what to do. We're supposed to get direction from the top down, but this shit starts at the top, man. Everything that's happened in the last week has just been amplified by, and I've made a point of not being too political, but that our fucking president isn't doing shit. It's getting worse and worse. You see protests around the nation spiraling into just pandemonium, and these protests are turning into looting, and it's just creating more and more of a divide between both sides. I don't even know where to begin. It's ridiculous. It's incredibly sad and dejecting, and it's coming on the heels of basically being in quarantine and lockdown for several months.
Yeah, I think all of that. I mean, I think you summed it up pretty greatly and accurately last week in Minnesota, and the fallout of frankly, murder of George Floyd on the American streets of Minneapolis on camera from 3 different angles set off some of the most outraged, violent protests that we've seen in our country in decades. And it just, again, highlights just the systematic failure to a large body of the American population that's gone seemingly forgotten for, since the onset of our country. I think that you covered a lot of the points that have kind of made this event, this murder in police custody, a little more I guess, widespread as far as how many people are talking about it, how many people are sharing it on social media. I think the social media aspect of it has definitely led to an increase, because we see people nationwide being able to watch this video, communicate about it online, and organize and take to the streets in an effective manner. I'm sure there's been the outliers of the rioters and the looters that we've seen dominate headlines in the media, but to me, highlighting that fact kind of takes away from the overall kind of message that a majority of protesters are trying to get across, and that's that they feel downtrodden by a system that's been in place for decades, and quite frankly, they're fucking tired of it, and they want to see change. And we really don't get political on this podcast because it's predominantly about sports. It's 100% about sports. We want to be a fun, free-spirited podcast that makes jokes and isn't taking things too seriously. But in times like this, when you've seen such an absolute failure from the top levels of government, you can't just sit back and pretend like everything's okay. Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever you are, it's all the same in the end. The leader has to have some level of empathy and be able to speak to the people, his constituents that he represents, not just the ones that voted for him in 2016, because that's not how this shit works. It's not how the American system works. Presidents for decades have responded to national crisis with comforting words on TV and ensured that people know that they're taking care of it. This time, he's cowered in a bunker in the White House and brought in military troops, special police units. I don't even know. Some of the pictures I've seen online, they don't even have identifying badges or anything. They're just like tactical military looking people standing in front of national monuments and public parks and random, Interstate I-35, all sorts of just places that we've literally seen hundreds and hundreds of times because this is where we live, and now it feels like we're being occupied in a sense. And that's just flat out wrong. And like you touched on, I think it's important that I say it too. We're both white, male Americans from the middle class, upper middle class in some instances. And we don't know what it's like to feel that kind of anguish and hopelessness that comes with like seeing a cop and automatically being scared. Me as a privileged white male, even when I get pulled over for speeding, I get nervous, and I'm from a place of privilege, so I can't even begin to fathom how terrifying that would be if you're a minority in this country, and it's just not right, and it has to change.
The interesting thing about this is that this has been happening. I mean, I'm 25, and I have a handful of experiences where I can point to some, instance of police brutality and the, backlash that it received. I've never experienced something like this. And what's your take on this? Excuse me. What do you think led to? I mean, we've seen this several times before. Even in Dallas with Amanda Geiger, Fort Worth a couple of years ago. We've seen it with Philando Castile. The list goes on and on. This is not a new thing. What do you think finally tipped the scale for the community who, like you've sort of touched on, has been experiencing systemic racism and prejudice for decades and decades, ever since, honestly, the creation of this nation. What about this made it the powder keg?
I think that this time around, and it's not right that it takes something this glaring to set the nation in action toward trying to make some sort of change. But I think the fact that, one, there was a video, a plain as day video, showing the murder, showing the cops nonchalant, just persona when it comes to kneeling on another human being's neck, hid his hand in his pockets. He was looking like he's done it a million times before. And upon further investigation, it turns out that this particular officer, former officer, Chavrin, I think is his name.
Derek Chauvin.
Chauvin. he just has a history of this kind of behavior. So I think that video, along with the length of the video and the subsequent response, whether right or wrong, from the people of Minneapolis, when a group of people is so angry that they don't know what to do other than take to the streets and forcing the media and the American people to listen through aggressive, violent action, you're ignorant if you think that that's just for no reason and that they are just out to take advantage of a situation and steal some Jordans from a shoe store or from a Target or whatever the hell, like certain factions of the population is commenting on. It takes something so glaring and so violent and so wrong to mobilize that many people, and I think that Minneapolis literally burning to the ground on national television really inspired and outraged a large faction of the country to say, you know what, this isn't right. This could happen to me, and this has happened over and over and over again, and nothing's been done. So what are we supposed to do?
And typically the fallout of a situation like this that we've experienced is everyone's up in arms for a month, and then it's not trendy anymore, and people change their profile pictures back to their traditional whatever. I'm calling out the suburban white folks. It's some of them are they look at this as just like a social experiment to say like, hey, I'm woke, I'm down with the movement, Black Lives Matter, blah blah blah, and then a month passes and nothing happens. The momentum fades. Progress comes to a halt, and we kind of we turn a blind eye to this until it happens again. And it's been historically this has repeated itself over and over and over again. And I really feel like this one is different. I really do, and I hope that's the case. And to your you made a point about the looting, and I feel like that's such the entire process of a protest in its heart is what this nation was founded on. Mm-hmm. We're a nation of rebels. We saw an injustice, we rebelled. Folks are seeing an injustice and they're rebelling. Most of the time, they're doing it peacefully. And if you look at the couple of instances, and I know it's not just a couple, but in terms of the proportion of lootings to protests, there are infinitely more peaceful protests going on. If you point to the looting as a reason to continue to not want to hold police officers accountable and say that, and I've seen this on Facebook, and we'll save that for a little bit later, but social media right now is a fucking cesspool. Yeah. It's ridiculous.
There was a cesspool going into this with all the COVID stuff, and this just kind of took it to a new extreme.
These people point to the protests and the lootings at Target and the Foot Locker as saying that this is justification for police brutality. That's fucking bullshit. Mm. I'm sorry. I know I'm a little bit fired up, but that's ridiculous, man. Like and if you actually do a deep dive and look into this, and I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist wearing my aluminum foil hat, most of these lootings are started by alt-right movements. Even in Dallas, right before the protests in Dallas and in Denton County, all of a sudden, on every street, several street corners, there were just piles of bricks randomly placed there strategically. And, Denton Police Department, Dallas Police Department was notified, and they came and picked them up. But these protesters are not going out to destroy businesses. And even if they are, dude, I know it's not necessarily the right thing to do. I don't fucking fault them for it, though. Target is a corporation that can survive that. Some of the mom and pop shops that are getting looted and destroyed. It's really my heart goes out to them, and most of the time these folks are having to the protesters' credit, there's all these GoFundMes to sort of say, hey, this is not us. This is not what we're about. My point being, if you're pointing to the looting as rationalization for your prejudice and blatant racism, it's ridiculous, and it's inexcusable.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I like what you said about being a nation founded by rebels, because America is a land that was founded after a bloody struggle for freedom, with a vision that all men and women are created equal And while some were victorious in that struggle, others just simply weren't. And that led to us fighting another bloody war over this, and it happened, and it continued on. It didn't change anything. There was, we got rid of slavery, we abolished slavery, but the prejudices and the response from Confederate America did everything in their power to keep African American people down after that. It wasn't
That's another rebellion right there.
It wasn't like we won the Civil War and then, or the northern states, the Union won the Civil War and all of a sudden racism went away. That's just not what happened. We've seen people armed against one another, brothers and sisters in this country, in the streets that we still live in today, and it continues still. We've seen marches on Washington during the Civil Rights era. We've seen leaders come and go championing for civil rights, and it just continues. It's 2020 now. Rodney King was almost 30 years ago. Same issues going on in our country today. So yeah, when you point to the rioters and the looters that we've seen circulating on social media and just say that that's justification for this excessive and aggressive, like, militaristic police response over the last week, you're just flatly wrong. And it points to a larger societal issue that people just don't understand, perspectives that aren't directly in front of them unless they really try. They're fine living in their bubbles and pretending like everything is good and proper, and we don't have the answer. We're average American citizens just trying to figure out how to make our time here as harmonious and decent as possible. But some things happen, and you can't just sit there and keep pretending that everything is right and proper. And we've both had conversations about this privately. We've had conversations with, like you said, people that went through the civil rights era and all of that. And if you can look back through the course of American history and see all of these moments that were supposed to be big moments of change, and we're here in 2020 and it's still going on, and you can still point to rioters and looters and people that are responding with anger and think that they're wrong and telling them that they should be peaceful, then you're just ignorant and stupid and racist and wrong, because they have tried peacefully doing it. They've tried for decades to do it peacefully. Martin Luther King's entire platform was about nonviolent, peaceful protest, and he got shot. They killed him. And then, more recently, everyone knows about Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the national anthem to simply bring awareness to the issue, and he is crucified and blackballed by the NFL and the conservative America for being this unpatriotic, like, terrorist leader or something, where he was just trying to shed light on an issue that is so clearly still going on today, nationwide. When all 50 states protest something, maybe there actually is something wrong, and maybe those people who refuse to acknowledge that should open their eyes and quit being horrible people. Frankly.
Yeah, well said. And the thing that strikes me as really unfortunate about the entire situation, the entire situation is unfortunate and just incredibly depressing and sad, and I don't know what solution there is out there. I don't believe there is one that is honestly pragmatic and practical in today's political climate. The thing that I've seen over and over again, and we've seen it after every single event, and the one that sticks out to me is Amanda Geiger, because I helped cover that story. This refrain that not all cops are bad and most cops are good.
Let me interrupt real quick. The one, he's just one bad apple.
Right.
One bad apple.
Try using that argument against people who are claiming that the looters are, the biggest problem of this. If you say, well, it's just one bad apple, and they're like, well, that's not accurate. I'm like, well, you can use that argument when it fits your agenda, but when it's counterproductive to your line of argumentation, you just dismiss it. It's ridiculous. But I know not all cops are bad, and I personally am scared of cops. Every time I get arrested, and anybody who's been or not arrested, every time I get pulled over, I'm shaking like a leaf. And I really have no reason to. I've never had a really bad experience with a cop. I know not all cops are bad, but we have evidence of a gross miscarriage of justice from the folks who are their sole purpose is to serve and protect Americans.
They swear an oath to do so.
What the fuck kind of serving and protecting are they being taught where they think it's appropriate to continue to kill minorities? And if all cops are not bad, and I'm not, once again, I'm not saying all cops are bad. I know that. It's stupid to think all cops are bad. I assume a majority of police officers are good people. But if you see a guy like Chauvin or somebody who has time and time again been reprimanded and reassigned from department to department because of his inability to act like a good police officer and protect his community. If you see that continue to happen and you don't point it out and say, hey, this guy should not be a police officer, he needs to get kicked off the force, you're part of the problem. You're fucking complicit.
I agree. The phrase that we were bouncing around people to justify this sort of like cop action in a way has been the just one bad apple thing, but the entire phrase isn't it's just one bad apple. It's one bad apple spoils the bunch. When something like this happens in a profession like policing, being a police officer, and Chris Rock touches on this in some of his stand-up, it's a profession that you can't have this kind of error. It's like being a pilot. If there's one bad apple pilot, the plane crashes and 200 people die. If one cop kneels on someone's neck and 3 surrounding cops don't pull him off and tell him that he's wrong for that and the person dies, that's wrong. You can't do that. It's ignorant to think so. I happen to have just a minor bit of experience in some level of policing. When I was in the Navy, I worked, you had to, so the departments would send, each department was responsible for sending a percentage of their people to the ship's security force to do 6 to 8 months of security rotation, and then you go back to your department and they send other people in. So I was chosen once to go and do that. So in order to do that, you're armed with a pistol, OC spray, like all the generic cop stuff that you see cops have. And in order to do that, you have to go through rigorous training, and not just physical training, but classroom training. And we were taught over and over again to, one, never pull out your gun unless you're under fire already, and to try to use the most basic level of non-lethal force if you can. We are trained in arresting tactics, handcuff tactics, all sorts of different methods to subdue a person who's engaging in criminal activity, to get them to be detained and compliant, so you, the security or police officer, can take them to a location for them to await justice in the name of the law. It is not police officers' responsibility to carry out justice. Police officers are not judges. They're not lawyers. They are not people of the law. All they are there to do is to make sure that people are following the laws, and if they are not following the laws, they take them into a court system designed to lay down proper, fair, and right, positive, whatever justice through the system that we've created. If you militarize the police and give them all sorts of, do you see the weapons and the tactical vehicles and the tanks and the riot gear that these police departments have in our cities? It's ridiculous. It makes no sense for these people to have this level of like Call of Duty Modern Warfare style fucking equipment to take on Oakland Avenue in downtown Dallas. It's not necessary, because when you give people that kind of equipment and you spend billions and billions of dollars on that kind of equipment, you're gonna use it because you bought it and you put it into rotation and you train people on it. So there's a systematic failure not only on the race side but on our general policing side about how we're going about the entire process. You don't need this level of violent interaction with American citizens who, as you put it, look to police officers to protect them and serve the community. Somewhere along the lines, we've completely lost our way in the American culture, to where we think that these people are here to control us under the guise of protect and serve, because it's just flatly not true. And then when you bring race into it, it's just a whole nother conversation that we're going to continue to have right now.
It's really hard to deny that we're living in a police state right now, and I know that's a little bit over dramatic for some, but if you look on the streets and you look at these videos of protests, and Ryan actually has experience with the protests, which we'll get into in the next segment, but in this, I didn't know about this until I started doing some reading. In '97, Bill Clinton signed the began the 1033 program, which transfers any excessive military equipment
directly to police,
directly to civilian police, or not civilian police officers, but police officers who are going through the most simple form of training, the most watered down form of training that I could ever fathom. The fact that police officers, if you aren't familiar with it, I recommend you go look it up. They're not being properly vetted, first and foremost, and that's been proven time and time again. But then they receive some just half-assed training, and they're given a gun and say, "All right, kid, go get it." And then you turn it. That basically that situation turns into a clusterfuck, which has manifested itself into the situation we find ourselves today. Because then you get cops who just want to go play war and play Call of Duty, but instead of playing on their fucking Xbox 360, which they should be doing, I just dated myself completely there with Xbox 360. But instead of staying home, drinking a couple of beers, and playing with their boys, they're playing it in real life. The one video that I found that literally made me start seeing red, I can't remember which city it was, but these folks are recording this tactical unit walking down the street, and they are situated on their porch, and one of these fuckers says, "Light them up," like we're playing fucking Call of Duty. Like, what the hell are we doing? These aggro dickheads get an assault rifle. In this case, thankfully, they were just using rubber bullets, which are still doing some. If you're saying
if we're at a state in this country, not you specifically, but if we're at a point where we're saying thankfully they're only using rubber bullets, have you ever seen a rubber bullet hit somebody?
Yeah,
it fucking hurts. It makes people bleed. It's bruising.
People are losing eyes
in
all
the
over the country,
in the proper spot on your body. It can like permanently damage you.
Yeah.
We don't want to live in.
That just tells you where we are.
We don't want to live in a place where rubber bullets are like, oh, it's fine. They're just rubber bullets. But we'll touch on the stuff that happened in Dallas over the weekend here in a bit. But in Dallas, they use something called pepper balls. Mm-hmm. Which, have you ever heard of these?
Yeah, I mean,
it's unbelievable. It's a soft rubber bullet filled with mace. That's psychotic. It's turned and used on American citizens, the land of the free, home of the brave. Get Bullshit. The fuck out of here.
So, rounding out my point, and this is as of 2014, 8,000 law enforcement entities have accepted over $5 billion worth of military equipment. I don't understand why a common police officer has to have an AR-15. Like, in what world is that necessary? And because these people are going to the protests, they're not coming like strapped up.
Have you seen these people at the protests?
They're bringing signs.
They're normal.
And masks.
They're normal people wearing masks because we're in a global pandemic and holding signs calling for justice.
And
the response they get is a full military.
Yeah. We can spend money on that, but we can't spend money on feeding Americans who have just undergone a global pandemic, which is still out there. And Texas quietly had its second largest day in cases yesterday.
There's 40 million people unemployed in this country, and we're spending billions on law enforcement equipment that we don't need.
The system's broken. The system is fucking broken, and it's incredible that we've gone to this point. We were sold this bag of goods, and I know we sound like jaded fucks, and we commonly come to this part of the show where we bemoan the current state of affairs, and that we were promised this great opportunity after graduating from college, and you're going to inherit the wind, and everything's going to be peachy keen hunky dory because we live in the greatest nation on earth. What part about this is great? What part about this is great? You look around the world, in the United States is just a laughingstock.
Rightfully so.
And it's like you have to laugh to keep yourself from crying, but it's top down. It starts at the top. And let's do a quick segue to that. You've seen so many people react in a different way, and that's just if you disagree, just log onto your Facebook, get onto your Twitter account. Everyone's having different opinions about this, and it's blatantly obvious that we are a nation divided. Like you sort of touched on at the beginning of this, Trump's version of the fireside chats is his Twitter, which is self-congratulatory bullshit and demeaning,
mixed with his favorite type of fake news,
and demeaning the protests and saying that the protesters are anti-American and against liberty, and he's patting himself on the back for the way he's handling this, which is ridiculous because if you had basically a playbook of how to get from point A to point Z in the best possible way,
national crises.
He is taking the most Jesus Christ, ass backwards approach to this. I'm like all fired up. My brain is just all scattered. But no, ass backwards approach
Take a breath
to dealing with this situation. Any other president would have handled this differently.
And I mean any.
Fucking give me Andrew Jackson. Like, seriously, at this point, I know the Trail of Tears, like, Andrew Jackson is probably the second worst president in the United States. I would rather have him right now.
Telling
Dead
me.
ass.
So to touch back on some of the police officer stuff that we were talking about, I think is important to highlight again for those still listening, that we're not an anti-cop podcast. We're not an anti-cop nation. This isn't a nation of people that wants no semblance of police force to uphold law and order. That we understand that there's criminals in this country. We understand there's people that want to break the law or do break the law, and those people need to be held accountable by a force that and a system that takes care of those, so the majority of mainstream society can live a peaceful, harmonious life. You're allowed to be pro-cop and anti-racist. There's a contingency in this country that seems to think that you have to be one or the other, that if you are critical of police, that somehow you're attacking the first responders and not an American, and it's unpatriotic, and frankly that's bullshit, and it's wrong, and it's again from the top down. It's all by design. There's people in the suburbs right now that I can tell you for sure, because I've had conversations with these people, that think that 25 miles away in downtown Dallas, it's just pure chaos, and that what you're seeing on TV is just, death and destruction, stores getting looted. That's just not true. It's peaceful calls for change in this country with the police directly involved. They're calling for police reform. They're not calling for the police to be abolished and live in this wasteland where we're all doing whatever the fuck we want. It's the Purge 2020. That's not what people want. And if you think that, you're just completely out of touch, and you need to reevaluate your entire life.
If you can watch a video of somebody getting killed by a police officer and you're okay with that, then, like you said, reevaluate everything about yourself.
To me, it's as simple as, if this many people are pissed, it's probably for good reason.
Right.
Even if you're a Trump supporting person who loves the police and you've always backed the blue and all that crap, if you can look at the fact that cities literally in all 50 states are protesting something, there's probably something wrong.
Yeah. Equate it to sports. If you're, say, a Baltimore Ravens fan and just a diehard, true and true Baltimore Ravens fan, and if Ray Rice had, that situation had happened, he had punched his fiance or girlfriend at the time, maybe his wife, I can't remember what status they were, but if he had punched and the Ravens had done nothing, you'd be pissed. I would hope that you'd be pissed. I would fucking hope that you would be pissed, because it takes down the organization and puts a dark mark on this organization that you support. Similarly, if you see something like this happen with one police officer, and I'm just boiling it down to that single incident, because it's been more than one police officer. There's been more than a dozen police officers. It's hundreds. It's hundreds of police officers who are complicit in this prejudice. But if you don't want to root out the problem and you maintain your support of this entity, then you are doing yourself a disservice, because people are going to point to you as prejudiced and just a complete piece of shit. Because if you are not going to advocate for progress, and society itself is progress, that's the point of life. Mm-hmm. We progress as a nation, as a society. And if you are wanting to sit there and drag your feet in the mud and stop any sort of progress in racial relations, then you're part of the problem. My sister put up this quote on we have a little quote board in our kitchen. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity with the oppressor. Mm-hmm. You're complicit in this. If my favorite football team had a bad apple, I'd want him off the fucking team. Mm-hmm. I'd want him off the team, because then I can't, in good conscience, support said football team. Similarly, if you support police officers, and like Ryan said, we are not anti-cop. There are a lot of good, really, really good cops out there. I know that. But if you don't want your local PD to improve, then there's just something wrong about the way you perceive society and the role of police officers in this nation. And you're anti-liberty at that. If you're okay with police officers just willy-nilly killing your American citizens, then you are anti-liberty. And I'm trying to frame the argument in a little different way that others who can, would point to the segment and say that we're just, lib cucks. Maybe that they can comprehend. I don't know. I don't know your take on this, but it's absurd to me.
Yeah, it is. And if people can listen to this podcast and all these points that we're making and look on the TV and see people who are criticizing police violence and call them lib cucks, then they are probably beyond reproach anyway. People that are more rational, because I don't think all hope is lost. There's people, you can convince people to change their mind. Life is about growth and inviting new perspectives into how you view the world, because it's not as simple as black and white, or police and non-police, or racist and anti-racist. It's like a freaking complex problem that dates back to the birth of this country. The black people, African American people in this country, from the very beginning, were forced here against their will. That set off a generational wound that has never healed. If you can't understand that this isn't something that began in our lifetime, or our parents' lifetime, or even our grandparents' lifetime, it's something that has been present since the onset of this country, and you can understand that it's a much deeper problem than, oh, you don't back the blue? Oh, I don't know what to tell you then, or whatever's going on. Like, then you're just not looking at the right things, because the events that have unfolded this past week should leave no doubt in anyone's mind that there's something wrong here. We're fighting ourselves again, and that will always lead us down a road with irreversible consequences. We're in troubling times right now, and I know that's probably dramatic in some people's eyes, but I really don't think so. I truly don't believe that. So, I mean, before we reach a place of like no return, where we're back again battling one another on the streets, and we've done things that can't be corrected, and it'll take generations to even to correct, we have to begin to urge ourselves to, especially if you come from a place of societal privilege, to take a step back and really think about this from a different perspective. And after you think about it, you need to force yourself to have uncomfortable conversations with people who don't share those beliefs, and try to understand where they're coming from. And finally, once you've done that, you need to turn your newly gained perspective on the members of your community and try to teach them, because you'll be shocked at how easy it is to just have a conversation with someone and realize that we're all human beings. We all bleed the same blood. We all want the same damn things in this country, and that's to live in a democratic, free society and provide for our loved ones and have fun and watch football on Sundays and play sports and see our kids grow and live in a society that is better than the one that we came from. And I do think that through all this violence and outrage and protests and everything that's going on this week, that there probably will be something to gain from it, because there just has to be, because the other option is pure chaos. And I think the response from large factions of the American population have been inspiring in ways, because it's shining a gigantic light on a very fucked up problem. And I've seen more people, just by social media standards, which I know is like an alternate reality these days, but just the amount of people I've seen that I would never have thought the way that they think, come out and hashtag Black Lives Matter and talk about how they support that cause. People from different demographics and socioeconomic backgrounds doing it. I think that a guy like Trump has no chance if people can rally together and take him down through the democratic process, because that's what we do here in America. That's what we do. People need to rally together. Young people need to vote. Minority populations need to vote, because it's the only way to make the change that we want in this country without it all going to complete shit. Trump's a bad guy. He's an asshole. He's a fucking sociopath, an egotistical narcissist, a douchebag, a fucking dick, all the names in the world that I can call this guy, but he's not everything. He's not an almighty ruler. He's a fucking reality TV show star. Yeah. That's what he is. Relishing in his moment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, my last parting thought, and let's take a quick break after this before we get into your experience of the protest. I think folks protesting out there, they just want a fair shake. That's it. They want a fair shake at success. And if we are truly the land of opportunity, they need to have that opportunity to succeed. They want a fair shake in society. They want to be able to achieve some sort of a peaceful coexistence with their fellow countrymen. They want to be able to receive the same treatment that white people get to receive, and that's not asking for a lot. And finally, they want to stop getting killed. Yeah, that's it. They're not asking for much. They're not protesting for much. They're not asking for a leg up. They're really not. All they're asking for is equal opportunity and equality. And if you have a problem with people protesting for the pursuit of freedom and basic human rights, then it's just not American. That's my last thought about this. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about the protests in Dallas. Okay, we're back. This segment's going to be a little bit different. I know that I'm a man of many words, but at this point I'm going to take a back seat and let Ryan tell our audience about his experience earlier this week. Ryan, who is one of the most gifted photographers that I know, and if you haven't seen his work, highly recommend. Ryan, drop your Instagram handle so the folks can come follow you.
It's at Ryan Lochhead Photo, LOCHHEAD. You put a K in there, and you're just bad.
So earlier this week, Ryan texted me, and this is from my perspective, that he was going to a protest. Ryan, where was the protest?
So the protests happened all weekend. The ones that I went to I went Friday night at Dallas Police Headquarters, and then again on Monday evening at the same location. There were two peaceful protests, organized by a group called Next Generation Action Network, which works in direct collaboration with DPD, Dallas Police Department, to try to bridge the divide between minority communities and police.
So when I feel like as a common American civilian, you see the media kind of documenting these protests, but you are sort of privy to something that most of us who did not go to any protests are not. What was the general feel of? Let's start with the Friday protest. Did you feel it all unsafe, or did you feel like everything was kind of on the up and up in the proper sentiment given the climate?
So Friday night's protest was peaceful from the onset. You get to DPD headquarters, and there's a small gathering of people starting to form with various variations of signs, chanting chants, no justice, no peace, hands up, don't shoot, the chants you see online, that are the popular ones. It's definitely peaceful.
The Friday one that you went to, Dallas Police Department, some great documentation by you, and you really told the story very well with your pictures. Was there ever a point where you thought that it could kind of spiral into some of the protests that you see around the nation, where they've kind of descended into violence?
Right. So Friday's protest, as the protest goes on, there's a scheduled march that's going on, and as we got closer to taking the streets and doing the marches that you see happen nationwide, the crowd starts to grow. It starts to spill into the street, and there is a sense of angst at that point. The chants are getting a little more angry. The crowd is getting bigger. There's people that you can tell were there not for the civic duty part of the protest that began much earlier in the evening.
But at any point did you feel that your safety was in peril?
No.
So it was the correct level of protests are not supposed to be comfortable.
Yeah.
But you never felt like you were in danger.
No, it was power. It was powerful. It was inspirational. The chants weren't calling or inciting any form of violence. The people in charge of talking were doing their utter due diligence to remind people to stay in line. There was certain members of the leadership group that were wearing armbands to signify and help direct the crowd as they took the streets to protest.
And what about police activity or their presence?
So the police presence, like I alluded to, it was at DPD headquarters. So nationally, there's cop cars everywhere. But the actual police presence at DPD was a few cops sitting off to the side, on not riot control people, not heavily armed, your regular cop that'll pull you over if you're speeding, just kind of watching. This is all at DPD headquarters. As we started marching down the street, we take a left toward downtown Dallas. It's the same sort of thing. You see cop cars along the line, making me think that there was a planned and scheduled route that the protesters were going to take, because that's just how the cops were aligned. Once the sun went down and we approached the first cop car, things definitely started getting a little louder and a little more direct toward police officers.
Okay, but all in all, successful protest. It did exactly what the group that organized this protest set out to do. Correct?
Right. The group that organized the protest, the group that organized many protests and is in collaboration with Dallas police and actually makes a significant impact on the community, were the entire goal was to remain peaceful.
So the first of the Dallas protests were in line with the majority of the protests in major metropolitan areas around the United States. Fast forward a couple of days post curfew, because Friday Dallas didn't start their curfew until they didn't declare until Sunday, correct?
Yeah. So a little, just to lead directly into Monday's kind of curfew stuff. Friday night, things get a little more violent. You see kind of the rocks getting thrown from a small group of people, agitators that are in the crowd. The people in charge of the protest and who had the megaphones were doing everything in their power to try to get people to continue marching forward, but they were not successful. Eventually, cop cars started getting pushed, cops are getting yelled at, and riot police eventually had to come in and take control of the situation, which included the rubber bullets and the tear gas and everything that you've seen nationwide. Bleeding into Saturday afternoon time, same sort of thing happens where you're seeing the roller bullets and the tear gas, which led to the ultimate 7 p.m. curfew that went into effect Sunday evening.
Okay. Monday, we Ryan and I text pretty much daily. He tells me he's going to another protest, and I got to applaud you for doing your civic duty, going to these protests and documenting it and telling the real story. There's been this this anti-media narrative for quite a while, and you see that sort of amplified during this process because unfortunately some outlets choose this sort of event to just get page views, and they're not telling the entire story. And I felt like you provided a pretty comprehensive I guess narrative as to what was actually occurring on the ground floor of all of this. And like I said, I give you major props for that. Monday, this other protest, still in Dallas, was scheduled to begin at 6:45,
6:30, same location
with the
DPD
curfew at
headquarters.
7:00. And this is pre curfew, or excuse me, outside the curfew zone when it was initially planned. But the organizers found out that the spot of their Monday protest was going to be in the curfew zone. So they were sort of scrambling to make a contingency plan.
Right. So the protest was supposed to start at 6:30. I got there at around 5:30 to kind of get a sense of the mood. And all of a sudden the crowd starts, moving around. You're like, what's going on? You find out that the protest was then being moved to the Crowley Courthouse, which is by the Dallas County Jail, which was outside of the original curfew zone that they had drawn. Since then, it's extended to past the curfew in the Margaret Hunt Bridge, but at the time of this protest, it was not. It was outside of the zone. So the intention was to bring it outside of the zone so they would not be breaking any laws.
Do you believe, and you can, choose to, plead the fifth, which is ironic in this case. Do you believe that the curfew zone was sort of gerrymandered in a way to make it that, that you could potentially catch these protesters sort of with their signs in their hands and sort of off guard?
I don't want to assume anything, but it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest.
So you approach similarly to Friday, you approach the protest and kind of try to feel out the protesters and the vibe. Mm. Was there any differences between the protests on Monday and Friday? And I know it's sort of intangible, and you can't really pinpoint the mood, but similarly, I think most of us can walk into a room and be able to sort of read it and feel the aura, if you will.
Yeah, there was a major difference in the vibe of the protest because of what happened Friday night. Not as a result of their protest, but it naturally got tied in with their protest because of how outside groups kind of came in and took over and made the narrative all about the looting and the violence. So there was a cognizant effort by the people who support this organization, the leaders of the organization, to ensure that their crowd, their people, their protesters know that this is going to be peaceful, that the police know that this is a peaceful protest. There was an emphasis on, hey, we're not rioters and looters. We're African American and minority people trying to voice our constitutional right, that is to peacefully assemble. So yes.
Now, at some point, actually, you know what? Just walk us through from the point where you arrived to the point where shit sort of hit the fan, if you will. Just give us a step-by-step and the timeline.
Okay, so once we leave Dallas PD headquarters and make our way to Crowley Courthouse, I had driven my car, so I didn't want to leave it inside the zone. So I circle around to try to see what the most strategic spot for me is, especially if the curfew was going to be as rigidly enforced as it was the night before, which all signs were pointing toward that, considering the just massive police presence that was already taking form. There was highways blocked off by state and local police, the National Guard, around 200 members of them were on standby not far away, and then eventually right next to the protest. So I make my way to the courthouse. I park at a bail bonds place that's like right next door, and I start walking. I cross the street. I talk to a state police officer who told me that right at 7 they were going to rush in and start arresting everybody on site. That deterred me a bit. I went back to my car to kind of reassess. I actually kind of pulled out of where I assumed the line was, judging by the amount of traffic being blocked off by sheriff and state police vehicles, and just kind of looked and surveyed. I let 7 o'clock hit. Everybody was still standing there as far as law enforcement protest was going on. So I said, okay, that must have been an exaggeration to try to deter people away from the protest by that particular police officer. So I drove to the opposite side of the Trinity River in Oak Cliff area. I parked my car there, walked across the bridge. When I walked down, I talked to a police lieutenant who told me that the county judge was working on an order. To preface his answer, I asked him if it was safe to go in there without fear of arrest, and he told me that for now it was, but the county judge is working on an order to extend the curfew line to government-owned buildings, essentially trying to make the peaceful protest outside of the curfew zone now a protest that is directly violating curfew, which is wrong. That rumor gets circulating again, as probably rumors are designed to do, to kind of cause some confusion. It actually gets to the leader of the group who's speaking's head, and he says, and paraphrase, he says, "Don't believe rumors that the Teletubbies are telling you. We're okay." Teletubbies were his term to describe police in riot gear, which I found pretty funny.
So let me pause you there. Whereas the protest on Friday featured cops, just like your standard run-of-the-mill Dallas police officers, there was a little bit more firepower. Right. For this protest, can you describe the gear that you would? I mean, and you have like a fair amount of knowledge from your background in the military.
Yeah, it was a night and day difference as far as police presence. If you aren't familiar with the Crowley Courthouse, it's a normal government looking building that's sitting directly on the main street. So you walk down the steps and there's a street there, right? So the police presence was to the point where there was around 50 National Guard troops standing directly in front of the protest, just kind of hanging out. No one had their guns up, but they were heavily armed. There was state police everywhere and Dallas PD everywhere, including Police Chief Hall and her, who I assume is her inner circle, because I've seen them travel around together this weekend, just kind of hanging out and watching and surveying everything. But the police presence was astronomical. There was SWAT team vehicles, there was full armored trucks, there was normal sheriff police cars, there was state police with plenty of ammunition to go around. It was people fit for an occupation.
I'm looking at some of your pictures now, and spot on description. That's actually kind of terrifying. Just the gear and the vehicles themselves it's ridiculous. Anywho, you get to the protest itself, and this is past the point of curfew. You said you drove to Oak Cliff, and when did you have a feeling that things were going to sort of go awry, if there ever was a moment that you could pinpoint?
So once we begin marching down the street, the leader of the group this time had a megaphone that he was using to lead chants to try to maintain the semblance of like organization, and it was working just fine. We were walking down the street, people were chanting. There wasn't the same sort of like outlier like screw yous, FUs, F the pigs response that we saw earlier in the weekend. Everybody had the chants down, the signs up. It was people following the order of the protest. So as we make our way under the freeway, we start to encounter more of the heavily occupied area. To our right was one of the heavy SWAT vehicles, the trucks that you've seen, blocking the entry ramp. Then as you extend forward, there was another SWAT vehicle with numerous police officers with rubber bullet guns, tear gas guns, and assault rifles standing outside. blocking the street to go forward. And at this point was where we encountered our first direct communication with law enforcement. Somebody came over the speaker, which I assume was in the truck, and it advised the crowd to not approach the vehicles, not approach the police. He said, "Don't approach us. You will get arrested. Don't approach us." So naturally, the crowd stops in place, continues chanting. Same thing: no justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. At this point, the police officer gets onto the loudspeaker again and advises the crowd to continue moving or they risk arrest. So naturally, the crowd is forced to continue moving, but keep in mind that the freeway to the right is blocked. The route back to the courthouse is now blocked by police, and the route through the intersection is blocked, leaving the only option in the moment being to turn left onto the Margaret Hunt Bridge entry ramp.
So they're funneling you, essentially.
Essentially. In hindsight, and in the moment, it doesn't feel this way because the police aren't being aggressive at all. There's nothing from the police. I assume they were being told to disengage. There was one person communicating from a loudspeaker to the crowd, and that's it. So naturally, the crowd turns left, and the entire crowd is going to then follow what was a peaceful, organized, and lawful protest at this point.
But that peaceful protest quickly turned into something that was not. And what time is this about? If you could guess,
I don't know the exact time, but I want to say it was probably around 8 to 8:15.
And you're still outside the curfew zone.
Still outside the curfew zone, and once we turn left on Margaret Hunt Bridge, now going in the direct opposite direction of the curfew zone. At this point, to get into the curfew zone, you would have had to go through lines of police and heavily armored vehicles. So there was no chance that you were getting anywhere near the curfew zone. We start going left on Margaret Hunt Bridge. We're walking up. The crowd starts to thin out because it's a uphill walk. So there's a little less like bunched up crowd. Plus I fell back to take some pictures of the police presence there because I wanted to get that. So I start jogging up the ramp to try to get back to the main group. And about halfway up the ramp, you hear bangs, and the crowd starts running back down the bridge, which made me assume that there was some sort of confrontation going on up the highway. So I continued to press forward and get to the main group where I see protesters now on their knees, symbolically with their hands up, chanting, "Don't shoot, hands up, don't shoot." They were met with a strict line of police in full riot gear, tear gas, smoke guns, rubber bullets, everything you've seen from riot police, blocking the highway in an organized manner and blocking I guess that would be the west highway.
Blocking the only way that they left protesters to travel.
Yeah, blocking the only route out of the bridge. The other side, there's numerous police vehicles blocking the west ramp going forward and backwards, essentially leaving protesters trapped in that moment. So they start shooting rubber bullets. I saw a couple people on the ground bleeding, blood on the bridge from rubber bullets. There's outcries from people to get the injured person out of there, so they evacuate them. At this point, there's still people with their hands up saying "Don't shoot." That's when they say there was no tear gas used, but there was definitely some form of like smoke used, and you could see that in my photographs. So at this point, that is enough to push the crowd back a little bit. So the crowd moves back as the riot police advance. the crowd stops again, hands up, don't shoot. The police then say something along the lines of, you're not going to get hurt. Everyone's okay. Stay where you are. No one's going to get hurt. The crowd naturally responds with, "You've already hurt us. You're already shooting at us." Chaos has already ensued, and it was started by the police, for lack of a better term there. So then people who were not as diligent to, or not as willing to get on their knees in front of advancing militaristic police presence, then try to retreat the opposite direction, to go back to their vehicles, I assume, and they're now met with members of Dallas PD riot control coming up the bridge, members of state police essentially sandwiching the protest at the apex of the Margaret Hunt Bridge. At this point, they're telling everybody to get on the ground, and everyone is compliant with that order. I do have to mention that there was one or two instances of people throwing water bottles at the riot police, but they
out
were,
of how many people gathered?
Number I saw was anywhere from 400 to 500 people. So a couple outliers that were immediately vilified by the protesters. Stop, don't do that. There was one person who was spray painting "No justice, no peace," and he was confronted by a protester and forced to stop. So up there's an unfinished "No justice, no peace" attempt at graffiti. So all in all, it was a peaceful protest, barring a very small number of outliers.
So at this point, there's some I guess a good not agreement, but it's passive, the relationship between the protesters and the police officers. But at some point, a ball drops and things sort of continue to descend. Is there some instance or event that led the riot officers, the police officers in riot gear rather, to sort of rescind their comment that you're safe, no one's going to get hurt? Or was it just sort of, occurred in a blink of an eye?
I think that comment was to try to calm the nerves of the people who were just being fired upon by the police officers. To the best of my knowledge, there was no instance that set off the police response other than protesters continuing to advance in an organized fashion. And mind you, the front of this protest was led by the main members of the Next Generation Action Network. That was very intentional. So the protesters were met by, or the police were met by an organized group of peaceful protesters, which makes me assume that there wasn't any, like, they didn't see the cops and begin throwing rocks at them or getting violent toward them. They saw a group of riot police and continued to do what they're allowed to do, and that is peacefully assemble.
So even though things were very tense, and really the point of this is I'm trying to understand, and because you have the actual first person experience and of actually engaging in a protest or documenting a protest, how it goes from being passive to just unruly. And I know you can't speak on every single protest, but I do believe that there are similarities and commonalities from protest to protest. And I really, and feel free to not answer this question, but do you think it was an the police officers in question overstepping their bounds, or they were egged on by members of the group that was protesting?
I think that this was textbook overstepping by the Dallas Police Department, the state police, and ultimately the National Guard. Everything that I've seen from Police Chief Hall has said that the protesters were now breaking a law by obstructing the roadway, which is bullshit, because there was a group of riot police waiting on that same roadway. There was no cars. There was nobody trying to pass from the Oak Cliff, Trinity Grove area into downtown Dallas using the bridge. It was a shut down city. The city was under curfew. It was occupied. There was no one around. And the protesters had no other way to go than up the bridge at this point in the evening. Yet they remained peaceful. They were not looking to loot anything or start any sort of violence. It was simply, in my opinion, a strategic, planned, militaristic operation to subdue an otherwise peaceful protest by the Dallas Police Department, State Police, and the National Guard. So once everyone was now on the ground awaiting their zip tie handcuffs, you start seeing different groups of police force come in and out in a well-oiled manner to zip tie, take names, set them off to the side. Another group would take protesters to a dart bus that I've now learned, according to D Magazine, was purchased by the city manager ahead of the curfew, so they knew that they would need to transport large amounts of protesters from one point to the other. Down to the Crowley Courthouse, where after much confusion we found out that everybody would then be released to their cars and not held on criminal charges or overnight.
But regardless, still a blatant violation of the First Amendment. Right.
It's which makes me fucking furious, for one, and for two, makes me think that this what was just an attempt, a very successful attempt to, one, show force, two, show force on national television, and three, to suppress the protests. Because if these people were breaking a law, they would be arrested, or they would be held overnight and processed. They weren't. They were taken back to their cars by members of the police when they were doing nothing wrong, and that to me is a blatant constitutional violation.
Just silencing the protest.
Essentially is silencing a protest through excessive force. We saw, machine guns, military walking in step, riot shields, police cars with their headlights on, sirens on, all the signs of intimidation and excessive force that was by design.
And you're gonna have to speculate here, but all it takes is one person to, and like I said, I get terrified around police officers. I don't know how I would have acted, but all it takes is one person to be agitated and act out for that to turn into just a full-out shooting spree.
Mm-hmm. It takes one person to like make the police feel like they should. All the police. I'm trying to gather my thoughts. All the police are doing is looking for any reason to react and feel that when they feel threatened and whatnot. There was no signs of this, and even if there is a bad actor or a bad apple in play in these instances, the police are supposed to be held to a much higher standard than regular citizens. They're supposed to be trained in de-escalation methods. They're not supposed to be the ones leading the aggression and turning it into chaos, which is exactly what happened. The chief of police, Renee Hall, she has since said that there was no chaos and that everything was fine and people were breaking laws, so they were dealt with. That's just a lie. It's wrong, and it's a lie, because the only people not feeling any chaos were the police officers, because everything that they were doing was planned and organized and carried out to 100%. What's the word? 100% effectiveness, I guess. Yeah, the only people not feeling threatened or in chaos was members of the excessive police force.
I asked you this question about the riot on Friday. Did you feel unsafe at this particular protest?
I
as a member of the press.
As a member of the press, there were moments where I felt as though I was going to go to jail. Sure, yeah.
And you had interaction with some officers, and you had to say, "I'm press, I'm press, I'm press."
Once I made myself, once I identified who I was and that I was a member of the media covering it, nobody left me alone. As far as my personal experience, I saw another photographer get yelled at by a police officer, and he was much more obvious about being a member of the press. So,
what's the justification? And I haven't read about this. You've been telling me about the chief of police. What was her justification of the basic violation of these protesters' First Amendment rights? Was it because she can't go on record and say, we just wanted to draw this to a close. We wanted to, put a muzzle on these protesters. Did she have any rationalization for the way it was handled on Monday? And more importantly, as somebody who experienced this, can you see how a protest like this, which you said, I admit it, I sound like I'm trying to get you, sort of pull like an old J journalism trick on you. But could you see how protests around the United States are descending into madness and giving other media outlets this snippet of pure chaos? Like, did you ever feel a point where, like, okay, this could easily turn into an absolute shitstorm?
As far as what, from like a protester perspective?
Sure. What I'm more curious about is how does one rationalize this unnecessary use of force, as we both agree this is? Like, I don't understand, as the spokesperson and most important member of your police department, rationalizing something like this.
I mean, it was a blatant and strategically planned attempt to silence a protest. The only time that I, as an individual, felt in danger and threatened is when I was at the front line of the protests being fired upon by Dallas police officers and having smoke and tear gas shot into the crowd.
Tear gas, which they denied using.
They denied, but they did.
If you look at your pictures, it's pretty obvious there's like some sort of smoky substance.
Yeah, so whether it was smoke bombs or not, I saw people crying and needing milk poured on their face to try to get whatever it was out of their eyes. This was nothing more than excessive force used by the Dallas Police Department that was planned to suppress this protest for fear of events like late Friday and Saturday during the day happening again. But that's beside the point. It was, as a member of the police, you don't have the luxury to be proactive when it comes to crowd control or assessing a situation. Your position puts you in a different category where you are reacting to things around you. The only time that you're allowed to, you can prepare yourself for the worst, but you're not allowed to use any of that force until something is already happening. You can't assume because a small percentage of people eventually looted parts of Dallas on Friday night that on Monday night the same thing is going to happen. You're not allowed to do that. That's suppressing human rights, and that's against the Constitution. There's a right to peacefully assemble in this country, and you have to let people and give them a chance to peacefully assemble and carry out that assembly to its completion. If it gets violent, like it did on Friday night, and when they had to call on the riot police to subdue those people, the people that got tear gas on Friday, like myself and other people who were there to document or just simply peacefully protest, were unfortunate casualties in the response from the police, but there were people causing violence in the streets the police reacted to. You can't then do the same thing on Monday night when all signs are pointing to an effective and peaceful protest. That's just not allowed. And I get that police are scared of whatever, and they don't want to see the city get burned, and they don't want to see local businesses get destroyed, but police are that's their job is not to assume that things are going to get bad. It's to react to them when they do.
How old were you when you received that training you were speaking of a couple segments ago?
I was 23 years old.
And you were told to do what?
To never use my sidearm or lethal or non-lethal force until a situation has escalated to the point that it calls for that. All you're supposed to do is de-escalate situations using non-lethal and peaceful, and non-lethal is such like a, because people are going to listen to this and hear, oh, non-lethal, tear gas isn't lethal. That's not the point. You're supposed to de-escalate. Shooting smoke canisters or tear gas or rubber bullets into a crowd does not de-escalate anything. It makes the crowd then react. The people and the police are lucky that nothing violent happened as a result of them firing upon the crowd. They're lucky that nobody acted outside of their minds and tried to assault police once things were a little calmer and a majority of people were getting zip tied. And I'm sure that was by design as well, because this took place on the top of a fucking bridge where there was no escape for anyone, nowhere to run. So, to answer your question, I just don't know.
I would hope that police officers would receive similar type of training. You know, I'm sure it's slightly different and it varies based on, you know, the precinct you're operating out of and whatnot. But I would hope that a police officer would be told, hey, don't engage when it's unnecessary. Don't engage or don't engage or fire upon anybody until you feel threatened. And that's sort of subjective, I guess. But I think you can make an objective standard of rules and laws to follow and provide some semblance of guidance to police officers. And the fact that they were aggressive when it was, as you're telling me, not necessarily called for, it's perplexing and points to the fact, I don't want to say it rationalizes or it provides a rationalization for what we see going around protests all around the country, but it's very easy to understand why they descend into madness. It's that sounds fucking terrifying. I would be shitting my brains out.
Mm-hmm. And again, I'm not someone, like we touched upon in the first segment of this podcast, where we and I and you are not anti-police. We don't condone rioting. We don't condone violence. We don't condone. There's this thing that I've been told countless times through just covering this event and putting it on the internet, and the comments coming back to me. I've been told that violence is never the answer, and to tell the full story, and blah 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 blah. And I agree. You have to tell the full story. I agree. Violence is never the answer, but violence is not supposed to come from the police as well. Violent people who act up and loot businesses and protest in the wrong ways that are against the law that cities don't like to see are wrong. That's not the point.
Therein lies the fucking problem. George Floyd was doing fucking nothing. He used a fake $20 bill, was going to get a forgery charge or something absolutely asinine, and it resulted in him dying when it was unnecessary. This is the problem in itself. This is exactly why people are protesting. It's just a gross miscarriage of justice, time and time and time and time again. And over-escalation where there needs to be zero escalation. It could have been a very cut and dry, easy arrest. Get him up, put him in cuffs, duck his head into your car, drive him to the police department.
And figure it out there.
And that would have been that.
There's no instance so I was listening to Bill Simmons' podcast earlier today, and they had someone on, and let me pull up his name so I don't do him a misduchess. His name is DeRay McKesson, and he is a member of this group they're called Climate Zero, and they have been working from a statistical standpoint trying to collect as much data about police killings in terms of minorities and overall police training practices and such like that. And he made an interesting point. when he said that he asks people who take his course and who talk to him, what is the worst thing that someone you love, say your daughter, your brother, your friend, can do for you to think that they warrant getting killed in the street for? And he said most of the time they don't have an answer. And that's exactly the point. There's no instance in this country, short of firing at someone, trying to murder someone with a weapon in the street, that calls for the police to take your life from you. It's unacceptable. It's not the right thing to do, and it's irresponsible. And it shouldn't be that way.
George Floyd was doing jack shit to warrant his death. Botham Jean was chilling in his apartment when Amanda Geiger stormed in and shot him.
We're chilling in our apartment right now.
These people aren't deserving of. It's not a death sentence, and a common police officer should not be entrusted with being the executioner, judge, jury, and executioner. It just should not happen. It should not be a reality.
And when powers that be, such as Dallas Police Chief Renee Hall, enable their police force to do this, they should be removed.
It's like a parent when a kid gets in trouble for bullying and gets called in the police officer. Parents get called. The mom walks in and be like, "Oh, little Jimmy did nothing wrong. It wasn't his problem. What did the kid he was bullying do?" It's just enabling. You see this on several different scopes all across your day-to-day life, and you see these enablers, and the fact that some of the highest ranking officials in our city enable is ludicrous. Mm-hmm. That is until you continue to go up and up the ladder and realize that we're just in a nation of enablers and sycophant yes men. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense. It really does make sense why this is going on. And
it's going on because all the tools are in place, and the police have resources and have spent billions of dollars to obtain these resources, and they're going to use them on the streets no matter what.
And people are fucking fed up.
People are fed up, and they should be.
It's a boiling point. They're starving. They're poor. They're facing a global pandemic still, which we haven't talked about, and that, I guess, a topic for another day. But they're downtrodden. This is the point where coups d'etats begin. This is where rebellions begin. The United States, we were tired of getting taxed by these British fucks across the fucking ocean. We were poor. We were broke. We were hungry. We wanted to govern ourselves. What do? We rebelled. That's how it works. When you have no other choice, when you're pushed into a corner, you lash out and you rebel. And most of these protests are doing it in the exact right way. They're peacefully protesting. But you know what happened to one of the most important figures of our time? When he tried to peacefully protest, he changed the world in some ways, and they fucking shot him and killed him for it. For doing exactly what you people who are anti-looting and anti-violent protest tell him to do. Peacefully protest, you shot him. Folks around the nation are peacefully protesting, and what happens? Police escalate the situation. It turns to a violent protest. They're trying to do it the right way. Let them do it in the right way. Let their voices be heard. It's not that complicated. It's really not that challenging to de-escalate situations and stop killing black people. Agreed. It's not that hard.
It's really not. It's really not that hard. And we, as your average, American who, goes to work and tries to live their life, we've been completely and utterly failed by the people that we've put in place to govern us, to represent us both. And I'm not speaking just about Donald Trump, because he's a result of years of failed political leaders, I'm guessing. It's important to vote. It's important to get out there and engage in the process, because if you don't, people like the people that we have in charge can freely walk to the top and make all of the decisions. So I guess my final comment on all this is that Monday night was bullshit. Something like that should never happen it shouldn't happen anywhere in the world, and it definitely shouldn't happen in the supposed greatest country on earth. It sucks that it happened in our city. It sucks that it happens all over the country. And the only way to change it is to start with you. Start, especially white people, privileged white people. I'm talking to you. It starts with you. You need to extend your hands to people and understand their perspectives so we can move on and grow as a country. Because if we don't, we're just going to descend into exactly the type of madness that the people at the top want us to descend into, because it's easier to control us when we act up, when we act violent, because it gives them rationalization to do the things that they're doing and act the way that they're acting, and they have support and they have resources and money, and the only way to change that is to get out there and listen and teach and grow and understand that it's not about you. It's not about your suburb, your small bubble that you live in. It's not about that. It's about much more than that, and we need to love each other because we're all members of the same human race, pursuing some version of happiness in a world that is so fucked right now, and the only way out of it is through cooperation and communication with each other, because the opposite side of the coin is ugly and dark and violent, and that's not what we want, because that's not the type of world that we live in. We're trying to leave the world a better place for the next generation, a better place than our parents left it for us, and we're trying to solve institutional and generational problems through communication and government action, I guess. So you need to start doing your part and pick your head up out of your ass. Again, talking to white people, because there's people in this country that are downtrodden, and they're literally in the streets yelling for our help. And it's time that you sack up and you do something about it.
I have nothing else to add. That's very well said. Just be better. We just got to be better.
Love you guys.